Right. Welcome to this Open Security Summit in April 2021. And this one is dedicated to the OWASP O2 platform, which is a project that I created years ago. I feel like it was my PhD in development and in security automations, right? And I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to walk you through the concept. See this presentation that I created 2011, right? And then for history, the tool actually came off Ounce Labs. Does anybody remember Ounce Labs? Ounce Labs was a company that did static code analysis that I was working for them. And I basically was their kind of director of advanced research, which basically meant that I was trying to figure out how to use the tool. And it's actually an awesome, piece of engineering, right? That the tool is, and I basically then developed O2 on top of their platform, and eventually I open sourced it. Initially, used to call F1 because I was saying there's the normal cars and there's the F1 cars, and it's like the stuff you research on the Formula One ends up going onto the main product. But then because F1 was very close to their main competitor at the time called Fortify, they said, you can open source it, but you can't call it F1. So I had to come up with a better name, and O2 was like Oxygen came along and was it. So let me give you a quick presentation about what it is, right? So what's O2 and the O2 platform? It's basically an open source platform for automating application security knowledge and workflows, right? And that's fundamentally what it is, right? It's this sort of platform that I developed when I was doing a lot of security assessments, a lot of reviews, a lot of code reviews and black box pen testing and application code reviews. And I needed to find a way to automate my thinking, right? I need to find a way to automate the, all the workflows that I had. And then, O2 is basically that extension of, if you write lots and lots of scripts, then eventually you start to writing tools to help you with the scripts, and eventually you end up in a platform to help you to develop that, right? Which is kind of what the O2 platform end up being, right, on this. So, and then when you start doing it, you're going to be able to do impossible things, right, that are really cool, and your clients will love it, right? And that's a really cool quote here that, it provides, a set of tools for performing all sorts of grain boxing. I'll show you the meta streams in a bit, right? And it's a really cool workflow that actually allows you to follow everything, right? And then, the main thing I want to kind of cover here, and I was focused on unit tests at the time, and is that basically the logic here is that O2 is like a scripting engine that allows you to develop things, and you write actually O2 scripts in O2. It's kind of like has a very C# kind of like reflection on storage kind of environment. It's a great black box and browser automation environment. It's a great source code analysis. It has its own .NET static flow analysis, supports actually Java bytecodes, and has a huge bunch of visualizers for developing frameworks. And also it's great to consume data and APIs and to create APIs. And there's also a whole bunch of graphs. And this is also the beginning of my larger graphical explorations and playing with all sorts of things to connect dots and connect traces, which I'll walk you through in some of these examples, right? And so basically, yeah, it's this paradigm for how to perform documented and distributed application security reviews. And the logic is, to automate security, consultants' knowledge and workflows. And I was kind of really thinking about this idea of non-security experts to access and consume security knowledge and unit tests, right? Which remember that this was all pre-cloud, right? It's kind of, I do feel that it was would have helped a lot with the O2 platform adoption and usage if the cloud was available, because I'll be able to package a lot of the stuff. And I think one of the things I want to do in the future is actually to do that. But this was really interesting, right? And again, this was before I moved more into the sort of the management and some other areas. But at the time, actually November 2010, I got to the point where it was faster for me to automate myself by custom scripts than to do it with using other tools and by hand. And this is very powerful, right? Because I got to this world where when I do an assessment, I would just build these tools that would dramatically make me a lot more productive. And you see what I mean in a second, right? So, you know, the thing about this at the time was also, I was talking a lot about frameworks, and because the framework, especially when you talk about a lot of static analysis and other things, every framework has its own thing, which is kind of why you need platforms and engines to allow you to understand the frameworks, right, in itself. And that's kind of, I was saying that there's lots of cool stuff that we need to solve. And the irony of this is that I feel that a lot of this has not even been addressed, right? You know, like all this technological, all these things that we need to be able to provide from, you know, to analyze things in terms of reflection, events, etc., and then rules management, connecting traces, auto attack surface markup, and then integration of black box. And even this is a smaller list of, if you want to really do good analysis, you need to be doing all of this. And it's funny because at the time I kind of said, you know, we were still at this sort of 2020, you know, if you look at the evolution, you have mainframes, then C++, .NET, HTTP, then you got the platforms, right? Where, you know, so a lot of the frameworks, then there was a lot of innovation, even in 2009, right? From new languages, new applications, online stuff. And it's quite interesting to think that, you know, at the time, cloud was still this native little thing, right? That was coming along. AWS was kind of still quite young, right? And I was even saying, hey, we are already behind and we should be here, right? And the reality is, I don't think we have moved much beyond this. I think today, I still feel that most of the engines and most of the security tools that we have are still very primitive in terms of understanding what actually is going on the applications, right? You know, it's really shocking that even today, you know, we still, you know, have, you know, barely evolved a lot of the technology, and even some of the new tools that come into play, they're still very kind of crude compared to what we should be doing in terms of the rules management and the visualization and the mappings of where we are, right? So, you know, the way I look at this, right, you know, to scale, right, you need to be able to, you know, you need to automate the security access brain, right? You need to, you know, this kind of idea that we want to capture, right, that expertise so that they're very simple to use by non-experts, and then we can create very targeted solutions, right? And then, you know, I was just, you know, thinking of this idea that you create these mini tools that do one thing very well, like the static analysis for MVC, you know, like a SharePoint security analysis, a particular thing for that, and then, you know, a security analysis platform for a lot of these things, right? So let's, so let's now look at O2 in practice, because I think, you know, it's going to be more interesting to do that, right? So here's a really cool example of the kind of tools, the kind of workflows that you can create with O2. And actually, this is almost like one of the end goals, where I actually build a real-time sort of vulnerability creation feedback inside Visual Studio, which is what allowed me actually to show that this is what the future should be. Annoyingly, we still don't have this today, right? But, you know, this is exactly, for me, what we need, which is an environment where when the developers are coding, right? And you can see here's a developer writing and doing some stuff, right? You want this mode where, you know, again, there's real-time compilation. So you can see there, real-time compilation, right? And when the developer, right, in this case, creates a security vulnerability, you want something, you know, to flag up straight away. So notice that at the moment, you know, just, what the hell? Notice that at this stage, right, you know, you have almost a vulnerability, right? So just to show, this is a .NET page that when you go request, this is basically tainted values, right? So this is a value coming directly from the outside, put here, and then that variable is going to call say hello, which is this. And at the moment, if you did a regex analysis on this, you could say, well, you use response.write, right? Or even if you put name here, you can go, well, you know, you might say there's a problem, but this vulnerability only exists when you basically have a vulnerability that happens from here, right? Basically to there, right? To there, and then to here, right? It's only when that occurs is that you have a vulnerability, right? So if I then press play, you'll see that, you know, that's what's going to happen in a bit. So once I do this, right, now you have a vulnerability. right? So this is kind of the key thing, right? Like in a nutshell, what you want is these environments where, once you pick up a vulnerability, right, you show that on a UI, right? So you can see, hey, there's a vulnerability, and it's shown on a UI, and then you want a situation where if the developer fixes it, then it doesn't show. So now you got this real-time vulnerability detection and feedback, where if I do this, for example, you can see that it's not a problem anymore because name is now static. If I do this HTML encode again, and you look the thing, right? I actually wrote safe name and I did the right thing, but until I do what I just did to here, which is I wired up, it's still a vulnerability. Once you do this, then you pick up that is not a problem, right? So this is super important, right? Because you have this sort of real-time feedback loops that makes a massive difference to the user, right? So in this case, for example, if I create a SQL connection, right, and I go SQL text is to select from users where user equals that, right? So if you, again, look at this, like this first version is not vulnerable because we haven't wired up actually the vulnerability, but because the variable name is still not there. But if I go string format text with name, suddenly bang, SQL injection, right? And you can see that the kind of the squiggly lines in this case actually show the vulnerability trace. So you can actually see, and there's another way to see this, but it's important that once when you comment, for example, that case, or you use SQL parameters in this case, now you basically have a safe environment. So if you look at these paths here, you actually have basically a mode where when the developer had vulnerable code, it was actually showing that there, and when it didn't, he's actually green, which is really cool, right? Which is kind of what you want. And then I think the next one is just, I'm going to show, for example, a file path injection, right? So you can see that we still have malicious data, and now it depends where you put it, you get a cross-site scripting, or in this case, a file canonicalization error. But this for me is what we want for UIs, right? Basically, we want this situation where when the developers create, right, a particular vulnerability, you want to get real-time feedback, right, on what's happening, so that we capture, right, what's going on. And again, like in this case, you see, you add that, then that's not a request redirection vulnerability, because now it's just an extra variable. It could be another problem, but at least it's not that one, right? And the other thing that you can do here, like you can see, like I pick up that value is now tainted, so I put it there, bang, cross-site scripting, right? So this is really, really cool, as a sort of a feedback example of what you want the users to experience. And if I encode stuff and if I validate stuff, you can see that basically the values go down. See, like server.html encode, server.html encode, and then the things get fixed. So that's the environment, exactly, and that's how it all should be, right? Any
Hey,
questions?
Dennis, I'm curious. Have you seen Sensei from Secure Code Warrior? It's Mateus Madu's. I guess he founded really the product.
Not the latest version. They do something similar.
Oh yeah, this is very similar to Sensei.
Cool.
Yeah, he extended this to other languages as well. He definitely covers the same languages. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Because I know a couple of people do function detection. Do they follow the traces across multiple functions?
Right. So do you know Mateus's background at all, or?
No.
Okay, so he was actually an intern at Fortify, and
oh, cool.
He worked quite a bit with Jacob West, and he eventually got a full-time job and was part of the SRG group there when Fortify was Fortify, and then HP bought him. But eventually he left. Anyway, he knew how to write Fortify rules and such, and so he pretty much covered a lot of the rules that you'd expect to find associated with the respective analyzers with Fortify. So it does cover the gamut in terms of Sensei. Obviously, nothing is perfect, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I don't know, it's been a while since I've looked at it as well, but I was really surprised on how advanced it was. So anyway.
Oh, well, then everybody check it out, right? Like basically that's this they do that. I haven't been exposed to it recently, but if that's what they do, then that's great, right? Because be interesting to see if they do they follow traces, how deep the traces go, right? I know there's guys like, for example, SamGrep, right? Who do similar things, but it's still within a function, right? It's still within a particular environment. Because in order to do this, like it's been happening here, you do need to build a whole object model, right, of the functions.
Right, the call graph, right?
Yes. You need to build a
For
call
sure.
graph, right?
Yeah.
In order to do that, right? And cool. So here's another type of tool that you can create with the O2 platform, right? Which is, and these are actually tools created inside O2 platform, right? Where actually you can see here. So this is kind of what it looks like. So this is one of the UIs I was exploring with, where you can click in there. You can say, hey, cool. Let me run a script. I also have this idea of H2 scripts that you can run. So what you have here is, and this is like Windows tools and stuff like that, where you can glue things together. So what you have here on the left is you have basically a browser going into browser automation. So the script actually does the browser automation. And on the right, you're going to see the stack traces and the findings of it, right? So you can see here that I'm logging in. I'm just showing a bunch of vulnerabilities. So this is basically SQL injection, right? That you can put through. So this is Hackney Bank, right? So Hackney Bank has this vulnerability, which is, like, for example, a SQL injection vulnerability. And then what you have here is a trace, right? That is basically showing the location of the vulnerability, right? So you can see here that and actually this is actually navigating the trace to show you where the vulnerability actually is, right? So you can see, so if you look at this is the kind of traces here that, at least, at the time, maybe now, right? The static analysis engines were really struggling to build, because what you have here is the gluing between black box and white box, where you also are gluing a jump between web services, right? So what you see here is actually two actually traces. If you look at basically the trace in a kind of a static analysis, you say, hey, I got my text subject who has malicious data, who then puts the data here, who then goes over here, who then goes into the parameter, and then actually in this case calls a SOAP client, who then is picked up by here to put into that parameter. And what's cool about this is, and down here you're going to see a SQL connection, is you see that in this particular trace, I actually glued the actual black box finding, which is the one you saw on the left, with the entry point of that black box finding. And then I glue with the next set of traces. So you can see that it starts over there, and then down here, it's going to hit. See, there's the second thing. So this is the jump from web services. So this is one of those things where, unless you do some kind of gluing and you put things together, this is where the blind spots in enterprise sort of applications occur, because you have these abstraction layers between the systems. So if you look in the Hackney Bank use case, is that you have a web tier who then calls the backend, but basically the vulnerability happens in the backend, but the web tier doesn't validate the data, right? So you basically have this flow where, unless you can glue the traces, you won't pick up, basically, that flow. And what I really like about this is that connection between, that black box URL and which is what you get from the trace, and the actual connection with the inner, vulnerability, and the fact that you're gluing three things. You're gluing a black box trace and two sets of static analysis tools based on a rule, which basically in this case I wrote, which is a way to connect this HTTP protocol invoke with the actual method invoked on the other side, which has a completely different namespace and a different thing.
Very cool. Very cool.
And this is like, this is why I kind of said that when you're doing, you know, more in-depth static analysis, you kind of need these techniques, right? Because or else you don't have the full picture. There's no point of saying that this particular web service, there's no data validation here. Okay, fine, but the real vulnerability occurs when that, let's say, top level of no validation hits a second layer of web services that are actually vulnerable. There's you know, it's hard sometimes to say, well, yes, I have some web services that have SQL injection. Of course, you could argue that none of them have, but if some have, you know, there's also the question of, hey, who calls this, right? Because there's also a lot of web services that they are vulnerable by design. A good example is a web service that gives you customer data. There's tons of them who do that, right? Now, I would argue that they're vulnerable to data exfiltration or you know, kind of direct object reference, sometimes vulnerabilities by design. The problem is, do you got a connection between something that has no authentication or no validation to that inner method that has that problem? So here's another variation of this where, so I think, wait, no, this is the same one, right? Yeah. So this is one where we kind of go a bit deeper, right? So what this is this is one where we're going to look at, you know, that sort of AST sort of analysis. So I call this kind of an AST engine. You can see that you can drag and drop the stuff and etc. And this basically situation here is I'm going to basically I was trying to create this sort of flows. So you can see that step one, load the files, and you can view the AST, you know, and search the stuff and etc. So this is this is when I talk about Glasswall being O2 Platform being a static analysis engine. This is kind of what I mean, because in this case, I'm going to load the files that you want to analyze. So you can see I dropped the folder here, and basically you can see that immediately you get some stats of all the ASTs, you know, all the kind of different parameters that exists. You got the source code, again, you can browse. You got the assemblies that you can track, right, in terms of understanding the flows. And then, you know, in this case, you actually are browsing the AST. So this is the abstract syntax tree of the files, which is kind of the core bits for the static analysis engine, right? So this is the bits that the static analysis engine goes on top, but it's really cool to also understand how the language works. And if you're doing any kind of graph-based source code analysis, you need to understand how AST works and how everything fits together. So and then this is actually a very big little distinction here, where if you notice, the first one was the AST. Now what you're going to see here in the code DOM is you now start to see, you know, other kind of references that have been resolved in here, right? And this is very important because you can see, look, there's methods, right? And also you're now starting to declare. So if you look here, the understanding that this is a class, for example, and it has some namespaces. And when you want to, for example, resolve the fully qualified name of some of the things, you need these references, right? You need to understand these sort of scopes and this understanding. And if you look at, for example, this guy here, you know, it actually has resolved the class, right? Which is super powerful because now I can come here and say, hey, give me all the methods, you know, give me the methods that is SQL, right? And then, you know, you can actually start to get a much better understanding of all the flows. So I used to do this when I was doing other sorts of very specific static analysis, and I had all sorts of questions that I want to understand, and I want to validate certain things. This really allowed me to scale and massive code bases. So you would find, for example, all sorts of vulnerabilities when you're doing code analysis, because this is like having an object model of the source code in my fingertips. Any questions?
Dennis, is there, you know, in terms of the project, is there, what I guess, are you reviving it or what's
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
the
I want
status?
to bring it to life. I think there's so much stuff in here. Like part of my frustration is I look at how some of my dev teams, right, operate. I'm like, you guys not using stuff like this, right? And like this is stuff
Right.
that I had. It's quite interesting because I was developing this from a security point of view, right? I was developing this because it was making my job as a security professional, as a security researcher, more effective. And I always take the view to say developers should be using these every day, right? Because developers, you have the same questions, you have the same requirements, right? And now that I lead some engineering teams, I'm going, my devs are not using stuff like this, right? They're not building tools. They're not, it's very primitive in a way, the way they develop still, right? According at least the way we could be developing, right? So absolutely, right? So I feel like I want to bring back some of these ideas, right? Especially, for example, something like the method streams, that is insanely valuable, right? I'll show you that in a second what it means.
One of the things, Dennis, that I don't know they haven't touched on is more of the that I run into more often is the now you have with the stacks, right? You have multiple languages, right? So you'll have maybe JavaScript
Yeah,
or and all the frameworks that come around with it, right? Angular, Node, what have you on the front end. And then there's APIs maybe connecting to Java, right?
yep,
With maybe some, I think probably at the time that you were developing this, maybe Rhino was around, right? To provide
yeah,
that glue between, and actually Fortify uses Rhino.
uh,
But in any case, right, like, so you have these multiple languages as part of maybe a monolithic application, and they're still around, right? Like older applications, right, are probably more with vulnerabilities than they are with these microservices. So this predates these microservices. Now, probably if you were building, something like this today, you would break it down into microservices and have the respected languages within each microservice. But in the past, right, it was all kind of, lumped together,
yeah,
monolithic app. I mean, I feel like there is still some movement to do away with microservices today and go back to more of a monolithic application, if it makes sense, because now we're finding like managing these microservices everywhere has its brought, some cons with it as well. Anyway.
yeah, it does. But like, first of all, I actually think that the microservices word had kind of a bad rap. And if you think about it, serverless, right? And a lot of our cloud deployments, they are all microservices, right? It's just that people stop calling it because they'd realize. But I feel that this concept of mapping what you have and gluing everything together, right? If anything, is even more needed because but I would say my understanding of what is an application has definitely grew. So these days, I call the application everything that is required to run. And that includes the whole CI pipeline, includes all the deployments, includes the server setups, all that jazz. All of that has to be visualized. All of that has to be understood, has to be modeled, because you can have insane vulnerabilities that are created depending on the way that things are deployed. If you look at a Kubernetes application, it's fundamentally a massive interconnected set of systems, right? And even a monolith is just a massive interconnected set of systems that you need to model and understand. And you need to almost have, traces or visualizations and models for each of those pieces of languages, and then be able to glue them together. Does that make sense? Cool. So let's just continue here. So you can see that, and one of the things that I always find that it was very powerful when I was doing static analysis was this idea of who calls who, and sometimes just getting those informations is it was so valuable. Which in this case, I know that for example, invocation expression in this case is everything that gets invoked. So I'm now tracking all the calls. So in this case, you could see that I searched for pass in there. So I found, for example, every single invocation that actually has password as one of its parameters. right? So it was, and you can see here, this is every single invocation that exists in the application, right? And for example, here are every single comment that exists on the application. The logic here is that you want to think of your code as an object. You want to think of your code as a graph. So you need to be operating at this layer to do that. Now, the method streams is what's really, really cool, right? Now, I need to explain this. This is one of the biggest innovations that I think I did in O2 that is still, really needs to be copied, and somebody needs to implement this better, right? So a method stream is what I call a method stream is basically, it's a bit of source code that you start with the original method, for example, and then you map out, right, every single call that happens on that method, right, and then you map out all the basically like you map the call tree of that method, and then what you do is you create a file that has all the codes that is relevant to that call tree. So if you look here on the right, what you have, and you can see that it's a bit of a longer method, is this class here on the right doesn't exist on disk, right? So this class here on the right, if you look at it, right, is basically a class that you have the delete user, which calls this, right? But that function calls the create SQL command, right? So if you look here, you basically have the delete user calls the SQL Server Engine execute as SQL command, right? That is another class. See there? There's a class called SQL Server Engine, which is just below, right? So now if you look at basically what happens next is that class is going to call the global create SQL connection, and then there's these things here. So what you see is that these extra classes are going to be all placed in this file. So this file contains all the code, and in fact, I even put a graph in here. Look how cool is that? I even put a graph in here to follow the sequence of events. But the code stream is basically a file that have the source code of all the call tree from that initial place. And that means that if you're doing a code review, and if you're doing analysis of the code, it's super powerful because you see in one place all the code that is relevant to that one starting point, which is really freaking cool, right? And then in here you could also see the kind of the source code analysis of the sequence of events, where you could see that once you pick, like, let's say this guy here, right? So he is a call tree of that particular place. So that means that that variable is going to end up being sent to all these different locations, right? So you could see that. That's why I'm saying that the O2 actually has a pretty decent static analysis engine, because basically this is what you need to do that, right? So you can see the destination account goes to here, calls that, calls this. So this is a pretty cool sequence of events that shows you actually what is actually happening until you actually hit the vulnerability. And then eventually, I got the thing here where you can actually write a rule, right? So this is like a real rule engine where you can write a rule. You pick in the rule, but it creates the method streams to pick up the stuff. Then you actually, and there's again that file I was talking about, the file that doesn't exist in disk, but it's created here. Then you actually write the rule that says, I'll take a web method. Then you have what's called the code streams. So the code streams is basically every unique code path that exists in there. So this is basically going to create every single path that exists in that particular file. So you can see here, there's the path 1, right? There's path 2, etc. So this is like following the sequence of where the data exists. And eventually, if you have a source to sync, if you have a place that we know is vulnerable with data to a place that can't handle it, then you actually get a type of vulnerability, right? And this is the kind of stuff that developed originally that allows massive findings analysis, right? Where if you have this was designed when you have 10,000 findings, right? All sorts of stuff that you can actually manipulate like that. So this was kind of my, I think this is sort of where I left, where you can see in this case, I actually find all those variations of SQL injection on this system, which is pretty cool, right? So you can see here the parameter, the source account, all the way to the SQL injection, right? Which is pretty cool. But the key of that was that method streams kind of technology, which was really powerful. So let me show you another example of, actually, this is a variation of that, so we don't need to talk about that. I was just using Ounce Labs. So so this is basically, let me just pick another cool example. I think this is, yeah, so this is a tool where I was basically started to think about, and you can see here, like there's basically all these scripts that I wrote, right? That then you basically pick up, for example, the black box exploit. So the logic of this was to package this in a way that other developers or other users can actually recreate it, right? So you can see this is where you think about how can I create an UI that allow, right, the execution of the steps that I have, right? So you can see I can download, you actually goes and says, hey, you can download latest version, start local copy, etc. So in this case, in this basically downloads latest version of web codes. Then you can actually, and this is I believe actually was going to drive you, the automation to do that. And then so you can see that this is actually downloading it programmatically, right? So this is literally doing the web automation to download web code, right? Which is pretty cool, right? So once you've got that, right, and you start it, right, you can even go start local copy from there, right? You can basically start it over here, and then so the logic of this was how to automate stuff, right? How to programmatically create an environment where things can be automated, things can be kind of, the flow could actually execute from there, right? And then, in this case, I actually go through and, for example, show some exploits. So here's an exploit of WebGut where you log in. So you can see that I'm doing browser automation, right? These days, you probably use something like Puppeteer to do this, but you can see I come in there, I put a cross-site scripting exploit, then I come in there and it basically triggers it, and then you capture and say, yes, that got detected, right? And then you could also make one fail, and then you can restart the session. So all of these are basically an attempt to kind of replicate the findings, right? And replicate the audience. Sorry, not the audience, the workflows. Actually, this one's a cool one, right? So this is basically an example of auto patching. So this is actually, in a weird way, this is sort of very, interesting for example, the work I'm doing right now, because at the moment at Basketball, we're doing rebuilding to known goods, right? Which is files, but what you're doing here is I'm rebuilding it to a known goods of source code, right? So if you look at this, you see that in the left, you actually have response.write, but on the right, I actually added the anti-XSS automatically. So you can see here that on line 20, right, there is no protection, right? So basically, this version is vulnerable. That version is not vulnerable because on every response write, you add the anti-XSS, right? So it's really cool to have these modes where even if the original code has vulnerabilities, right, the created code doesn't, which is pretty cool, right? And in terms of automation and the kind of stuff that you can do. Now, this one is a good example of jumping through classes and types. So this is basically actually, in fact, ironically, I do it through .NET, but I was actually able to also consume Java on this using a couple of APIs. One of them is called IKVM. And what you can do with this is, and this was a really cool UI that I still wish I had today, right? Which is a UI that I can drop a jar on here, and what it gives me is a UI that shows me all the classes and also shows me the call tree. So you can see here that I can pick any method, and then once let's pick, for example, this method here, right? And then you see, for example, flow. So this is where you can go, oh, okay, that, for example, this could be a source of vulnerabilities. And once you pick it up, once you actually map the source code, you're going to see the call tree, right? So you're basically going to see who calls who, and you're going to be able to navigate it, right? That particular workflow, which is actually, again, super powerful, right? And I think in this case, you only need to do that once, because you want to do that once he picks up. So you could see, okay, so I got that guy, but then, if I now go and say, all right, let me look at this, send redirect, which is a source of, for example, security vulnerabilities, then you can look at who calls that one. So if you expand here, now what you see, this makes calls, right? And to these methods. So you could see that, that particular class, so method, makes calls to this, right? And then it's recursive, right? Because if you expand this, then you're also going to see, the next layer down, right? So then you get to see that not just who this calls, but you also see who calls it, right? So these call by is also a very powerful view. But let's just now look. I think we're going to look first at the call sequence, right? Of this. So okay, let's go back, right? So let's just skip forward a little bit, and yeah, and also, so this is again, these are all little things that are critical to catch up, right? Because, for example, if you hit on an interface, right? For example, here, so when you're tracking code, the problem here is that if the function is called by this guy here, now you have multiple implementations of that interface. So it's very important that you also can track back who actually implements that particular interface, and then what calls are made by that particular function, right? So you could see that, even here, like you could see that you already got 2 layers of interfaces, right? The validate redirect location is implemented by this guy. The isValid import is implemented by, the next line down. So, it's very important that when you're tracking code, you basically get to then understand, who is implemented. And actually, I did a version once where I was going deep, and I was actually even looking at trying to resolve those things, right? To understand actually the flows. So basically, this is the real world analysis of who is actually calling who in this sequence of events, right? All the way you get to, to the methods that actually do some stuff, right? And you can see how deep the rabbit hole goes, right? In terms of understanding the flows here, right? Which is really cool, right? And then the other thing I believe I'm going to show here is, yeah, you can see, keep going down. Although I'm not sure if this video has it, it might not has. Yeah, and actually at the end, okay, so when you get to the end, you also then have the ability to actually look at the actual code, right? And understand, for example, the actual call to location. So that's all the places that those calls exist, right? So where they actually, who calls those. So this was actually really powerful. For example, if you look at analysis, is you take a bit of source code and you see what are every single place, and this is actually the line of code that does it. So you can see that all of these are great tools to perform code analysis and to automate, your flow. And that's kind of what I was building with the O2 platform, right? Any comments?
Nope, just brilliant stuff.
So is this available? I guess, can you run this today though, or is there some updates that need to happen?
Yeah, still runs. I'll show in a second, right? Still there. So here's actually a real world example of when I was doing a lot of Spring MVC vulnerabilities detection. This is a good example of how I do it, right? So basically, it's when you have Spring, right? Spring MVC, one is there's a lot of different ways that you can actually connect basically bind the data from the outside world to a file, right? So if you look at something like this, right, you got, add item to cart, right, and you can see all the different methods. And basically, I got this by parsing the config files and also the source code, right? So if you look at this, the power of this tool is that it gives you now this information about what's in there, what's the file name, but more importantly here, what's going to be the class that actually does that. And in fact, and which you already, you could see the command class, the command name, the methods, the Java class, which is kind of what I showed them on the right. And the thing about this, then you can actually start to understand is what kind of exposure do you get from here, right? So one of the things that's interesting is in Spring, you look at something like this, that's these orders, yeah, right? So so one of the, yeah, there you go. So if you now look at this part here, what you have is a situation where the account name. So if you look at this, right? So this is where the vulnerabilities occur, right? So you got these modes where the particular, in this case, shop edit account, it basically takes the data from the outside world and binds it to this account form, right? So basically it means that every object that comes from the outside world is binded to the account form, right? But when you, which is okay, as long as the account form only has fields that should be binded, right? The problem that you see when you expand that particular class is you see that the get account has a whole number of fields in there, right, that are very dangerous to be set, right, directly, right? And then basically this is the model that you have here, where so for example, in this case, the vulnerability here is that you can actually this value, I think the repeated password should, I believe in this case, should not be set remotely, right? Because at the end of the day, right, is I should not know the original value, right, on this. And in this case, I can actually basically set the password twice. So I can set the password because I can tell what is actually my original password. But the worst part on this one is actually not this guy, is the order form. So if you look at the order form, if you look here, when again you have the new order form, right, the form backing object in this case is binded from the data that you get from the outside world. So this is just creates the object, right? And then further down here is going to, like, actually that code sample that you had there is basically takes the data, the order form from the outside world, and binds it here. And now if you look at the order form, what you see is basically that if you expand it, you get the order, okay, the confirmed, which you can argue, not sure if that should be set from the outside world. But the worst part is when we expand the order object, which you got there, you can see get order, right? When you expand the order object, you now, let's see, yep, it goes there, go and expand it, right? You now get all these values, right, here, for example, including the order ID and the total price. See that guy there? So clearly that's not a value that you want the user to be able to set, right? So what you have here is an object, and this is very common in Spring MVCs, right? So you have an object where not only you have the normal variables that you should be binded from the outside world, you have an object that allows the set of things which are basically very dangerous, right? In this case, the total price and other modes that you have here, where you should never allow those values to be set by the outside world. And in case he get line items, not only we can do that, we could also grab the items of what you're buying, right? And you can even modify the unit price and and the quantity of what you're buying, right? Maybe the quantity you can edit, but definitely the unit price, you should never be able to edit it, right? So this is a good example of a visualization of a vulnerability, right? That occurs. And this actually gets a bit worse because you actually get the item object. So I believe you actually can change the price for everybody, right? But and this is actually the demo of Spring Framework, right? This was literally the demo that they provided at the time. I need to see if it's still there, right? But you basically, this object is the kind of stuff that I visualize, using the O2 platform, and the kind of mini tools that we should be creating for every application to understand the attack surface and understand how everything kind of fits together. Here we go, right? So if you want to see the vulnerability that I just showed you in action, here it is, right? So this is basically another O2 platform mini tool that I created that basically, and you can see just a bit of, C# scripts. So in this case, I even, automatically detect that. So you could even just double click on that guy. And if you have O2 platform installed, that will literally be running that script, right? Which now is going to show you that vulnerability in action. So and this is like web automation, right? So what you have here is now basically a web automation script that I can look at the normal requests. So you could see normal requests, you go to the store, you sign in, you go to fish, right? You pick something, you add it to cart, and then you basically buy it, right? And you just go, give me there, and there you go, right? So if you look at this, you got a nice, one guy for $18, etc. Right? So the local total value should be 18. So that's correct, right? So now I'm going to show you the variation of the exploit. And in this case, you can even do it from the URL. So it's even simpler, right? So I'm going to basically change the total price of what I'm buying to $1.99, right? So I'm going to buy the same thing, right? And you're going to see that I'm going to go there, I'm going to buy it, I'm going to add to cart, right? I'm going to do the move, I'm going to check out, and I'm going to do the new order, all nice and good. And actually, if you look at the URL, first of all, you could see that now the total is, actually I changed to $2.99. So you can see the total now is $2.99. So I got the same quantity, the same price, but the total actually is $2.99. And you can actually see that at the top, the exploit was to add this extra parameter called order.total price equals $2.99. So guys, so he's basically that privileged exploit in action, where you basically see the the modification, the quantity is the same, but we modify that. Now the next exploit is actually going to change the quantity, the price, and the total price that you're going to buy for, right? So that's and now let's change that to $3.99, right? So now I'm gonna, again, so you can see the power of, even when you're doing security assessments, the power of just being able to go effectively to the point where you do the payload makes a massive difference. So I'm automating this, and now you can see, right? So if you look at this guy here, now we bought 12 things for a price of 12, but of course that's still 1344, but the actual total is $3.99. And if you look at the URL here, you can see that order total price is free. Order items is actually, I think that says that's actually an array. So that's going to be, order items 0, array 0, unit price 12. And then the line items quantity equals 12. So you can see that we're totally manipulating the shopping cart. And I have to say that I found this vulnerability in a lot of high profile, applications, right? Who basically had all sorts of objects being exposed, right, through literally this vulnerability. But it's really cool to be able to programmatically get to the point where you manipulate the request very easily, and you can automate that. But also you can give developers something that they can replicate. So this is basically an integration test, right? That shows that the vulnerability exists on this application, right? On this. And I think on this one, the exploit is actually to add that value as a field, wasn't it? Yeah, so if you look here, this is actually showing that you could also manipulate it on the post parameter. So the other ones were using get. This one here, you actually inject on the code here. So can you see there? We added another field called total price, and ironically, this, I did once a demo where we actually did exactly like a payment like this. And it's annoying that the UI was not perfect, but the logic was that you actually added to the UI, say, hey, here's what you're buying. And by the way, how much you want to pay for it? So that was one of the coolest exploits I've done in the past, right? And it's, which really showed that, the power of the exploit, right? And the power of the vulnerability. So there you go. See, 0.099 price. And in terms of the workflows. So it's a pretty cool demonstration of the impact and the power of this. So I think I think the best thing is there's a bunch of automations. Actually, maybe this one's worth just showing. Okay, this is one to do with, and again, just showing some of the scripts. So this is one where I'm actually automating Notepad, right? And so basically, so this script that you just seen here, has actually been created. All of it was actually automated through Notepad, right? Was all a script. So if you, and this is actually the main UI of the O2 platform, right? What you're seeing right now here, right? So what you see, the way you look at this is the source code that when you write here, it compiles programmatically, and then you can just automatically, and then you can just execute it, right? Of course, that combination, automatically is only interesting, or is relevant, in the .NET world, because of course in Python is all interpreted, but in .NET, right? Because this is written in C#. But it's good to get the feedback. But what's cool about this, if you look at the API, I try to make it this really, really clean. So if you look at this, you get a process, Notepad, then you get this GUI automation, which you pass the process in, and now you can manipulate it, right? So, okay, I need to grab the reference. Now I can move the thing. I can basically, grab all my text boxes. I can move the mouse to the text boxes. I can move it around. I can set the text so you can see this is the text that's happening. I can wait a little bit, set more text, and then I'm going to click on file, click, go and go to file, click on it, go to exit, click. And of course, the only reason you have this is so that it shows in the video, right? But you could see that, and then, eventually I'm going to choose no, and then you go. So like, if you look at this automation, I'm going to modify, okay, cool, just add a new line to the text. I execute it, and you can see that now the code I just wrote is now being executed. So it's a really cool example of this level automation and scripting. And I think in this case, you have a mode where I can also sync the size of the notepad with a particular .NET control. So I'm going to do it with the panel. So this object here that you see panel there is actually this panel here, which is fed to this guy as a variable. So then when you do this, what actually you see happening is, see, so now that automation happens inside this environment. And that makes a massive difference, right? Because you can see that from a development is actually really cool to be able to see, all this stuff happening, right? Within, that thing. And you can see, again, note the Windows resize. Again, it goes into that little bit at the top, right? That you do, right? And remember that all of that automation is done programmatically, which is really cool. So yeah, so I had a bunch more, but I think the final little thing I was going to show is, and I got a couple of automation for Twitter accounts. I got, like some internal scans files, a bunch of tools, S3 browser, convert some data. And there's actually tons and tons of videos, right? And actually an AST viewer, I think it's worth maybe just to record and to show actually this thing actually running. So let me just show very quickly on this here. So I should be able to share my screen. Let me just find the VM. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually running basically a Windows box inside Visual Studio. Visual Studio Windows running on the Macs inside of VMware, Fusion, and where are you? That's annoying. Well, I could just maximize this, and then that's cool. Right. Okay. So you guys who cool. So by the way, this is where you get it. Everything is on bin tribe, so you can download the O2 platform from here. I'm actually cleaning up the OWASP website, so you also get the links from there. So this is where you can get the main executable. I also have a number of tools that I've packaged, which I'll show you in a second, because one of the coolest things you can also do with O2 platform is package the tools that you can then download from there. And actually, I got it some downloaded here. And then when you download it, yeah, so if you go into the tools section, the O2 tools, sorry, this guy's a bit slow at the moment, but yeah, if you go to O2 tools, you'll see that I've already published a number of tools on .NET, Java, you know, C#, web. I did some experiments with Roslyn, some other Windows tools, and then you know I'll walk you through some of the examples that I have here, right? So when you start your O2 platform, it kind of looks like this, right? Where you know you got a bunch of options here, you got a bunch of tools, you got a bunch of GUIs, the third-party tools, and some of these are just utilities. I think one of these is that you know if you want to run an IL spy, you know this should download the thing and then give you that. So again, these are lots of little tools that I use that I just make a little helper. The main UI environment is this kind of environment that you have here, where you know that's the one I was showing you, where you can then use this to create all sorts of tools, right? So you know the power of this is that you got this you know sort of real-time environment where if you notice here that there was that hello world at the top, I can type something, I can execute it. You could also, you know, a bunch of tons of options here. So I can basically, for example, auto execute on compile. So so this means that you know as soon as I make a change, it runs, right? And I cannot underestimate how powerful this is, right? How powerful it is to be able to program in a way that you can basically you know go and programmatically make changes to it, right? And as soon as something you know basically implements, right, you compiles, you run it, right? So and this is basically the UI that I use to create all those tools, right? So you get to see here, like, so in this case, see, look, I write go there, hello, then you know get a button, right? That's you know, and the point of all this is I try to really create you know an API that you know is very intuitive. So you can see that you know again, if I go add, insert below, from there add a button, click me, fill. So there's all sorts of other things, right, that you've got. But this is basically how I developed, right? A lot of those UI tools, a lot of those you know kind of you know views and all the stuff that you know you want there, right? So actually I believe that notepad example I was showing you there, right, you know, would be here, right? So so basically a lot of those stuff, and actually and then you know so here's a script that actually creates a notepad, right, where you get the action, the save files, all the menus, so you can create really nice complex UIs. So basically the entire UI was created with the script that you basically can see here, right? Which is really cool, right? In terms of the workflows. So yeah, so there's a lot of stuff to explore, lots of mini tools to create. One of the things that actually, let me see if this actually works. Actually, let me try it. So yeah, edit scripts, and then let's see if this works, right? Let's see. I haven't tried this in this version. Let's see if it works. Cool. So what this does, which is actually one of the coolest features, it actually packaged that script as a standalone executable. So this executable now here that has 600K is literally the script that you just created, right? So if you wanted to create a new executable, let's say I want to create, you know, my version of, you know, the util notepad, and you want to basically go, you know, instead of file, you want to call file ABC, right? Yeah, I can execute it here. You know, you will see that, you know, it, of course, that it already has that and those changes. But if as a standalone file, now I got basically an executable that has all those dependencies, and I just put it here to show you, like that is now a standalone binary that you can send to anybody that has .NET Framework, and that has your changes, which is really cool, right? You know, it's right to be able to have this kind of packaging, and the reason I'm going to show you, for example, like one of the tools that I've packaged, right, which I was kind of downloading and playing around, and it still works. So you got some invoke streams. Actually, for example, the method stream creator is here, right? So I can use this tool, which is a standalone tool, to create method streams. So if I, you know, I basically go in here, right, and I pick some C# code. So I'm gonna show you, you know, that guy working in practice here. So if I drag and drop the code from there, I'm going to pick up, for example, you know, let's say user management, or you know, or users community. So what you have here is the files. Here is the original source code where you can see users community, data factory, SQL engine, etc. If I now pick a method from here, so which is one of the methods from the top, so I'm going to pick, for example, this guy here, which is get posted messages. So if you now look at this, right, get posted messages, what you'll see here on the right is that method stream that I was talking about. So this file doesn't exist in the real world. This file was created by the call tree that was calculated by here. So you can see that there's the get posted messages, who's going to call the data factory get posted messages, which is here. That guy is going to call the return array lists, you know, containing all rows, which is this guy here. And you can see I'm tracking. And then this guy is going to call execute command recurrent as data reader, which is here. So you can see that you can actually follow the trace. And actually, in this case, you could even just, you know, see the vulnerability going on, which is basically what we've got, you know, with here. You can actually see the vulnerability of the paths that occurred. Actually, so there you go, session ID. Actually, this one doesn't have a SQL injection, but this one should have, yeah. So this one, yeah. So you can see here, there's a SQL injection, right? Session ID, actually message ID comes from there, is used here, is used there, is put in here, goes to SQL query, is put there, is put there, and eventually goes here, right? So, but the cool thing is that this tool is now available as a standalone tool that is literally that executable that you saw here. So this executable of 2 megabytes contains all of that. So it's pretty cool, that packaging. And maybe just to finish off, you know, on one of the other tools that I added here that is also really cool is the you know, this tool called the search engine, which again I used a lot, and is fundamentally a very quick regex search engine that I was able to. I wrote it because again I needed to do this when I was doing security reviews, but it's also super powerful, right? And the workflow is basically that you take this and you drop some codes in here, right? You choose kind of the files that you want. So you see, it gives you all the type of files. Even this I used to find quite useful, right? Just all the different type of files that exist there. You say, actually, just give me, for example, .NET files and stuff like that, right? Which is still, you know, this amount of files. You drag and drop it over here. This is now going to load 675 files, index them all, and then I can write a query, you know, over here, and I can do multiple criterias. So, and this is also regexes, right? So I can say, you know, SQL, you know, that, and then give me all the brackets. So, so I can basically, you can see it finds the files and it finds the things, but also it tells me exactly what was the text that was matched, right? To do that there, right? Which again is super powerful, right? To search. So even just these mini tools, which again develop on the O2 platform, and I can basically see, you know, this was a really great way, you know, to process large amount of data, large amount of files. Cool. I think I'll stop it today. I think there's lots of stuff, but my plan is now to do a set of sessions over the next, Open Security Summits that we can, what's it called? I might focus on a couple of single tools, or maybe a couple of topics, or maybe a couple of topics that people are interested, and then I'll keep expanding on it. And actually, I'll maybe write some scripts live and get people to actually maybe write some scripts during the next set of sessions. So
I would even suggest, Dennis, if this is loads of work, this is amazing stuff. A particular use case that you could follow from the beginning to the end, like this one that you were doing now, with the drag and drop of all of those files and the quick point that you can actually do those queries, which I would basically, use my ID and do a search. It would be even great, because I saw so much stuff that you actually have there that, me not knowing what you would be particularly looking for. It's just like, whoa. Where to start.
Yeah, and I think that, to be fair, that was always the thing when I was to show O2 Platform, people always go like that. Like, holy stuff, there's so much, there's so much stuff going on here. Like, where do I start? And I agree. That's a really good idea. So yeah, I'll try to think of a couple of use cases. And it's almost what you're saying is like almost showing a day in the life of an O2 user, right? Like what does he do, right? And what kind of tools he uses on a particular use case, right?
Because I got even more curious about the level of detail that you actually went when you were doing the security assessments, because you went through things that I wouldn't even consider. Some of them, yeah, okay, this one, fair enough, I could go through my ID, you can find it. The ones on the beginning looking for, what was the example that I was looking for? The one that you were using name and you're getting it from the request. Those are things that as a developer you tend to learn as you get, a bit more senior. But then you just started to go, woof, there's way so much more stuff. Oh no, there are tools out there. And one concern that I had when you were talking about extending this, for example, on the JavaScript world, is that it's going to be really, like if I wanted to create something for Angular, it wouldn't work in another framework. I would have to go and figure out the way that they use it and create a tool particularly for that. So.
But look, the reality is that somebody has to do that mapping, right? And so I would turn that around. It's like I got to the point where I could look at any framework in the eye and know that within a couple of hours, maximum a day, I would have modeled that framework.
Right.
See what I mean? Because the advantage of that. So go on.
My challenge there is, web developers, at least they're quite used to their own tools, and as creating a plugin that you could add to web developer toolbar or something like that, if that would be possible, then their adoption is going to be like crazy.
Oh, absolutely, right? Like I think that in an unfortunate sequence of events is that if I had developed the O2 platform in an environment where the cloud was more mature, I would have made a lot of the O2 tools cloud native. In fact, I actually the idea I had for this first talk was like almost like serverless uses of the O2 platform. I haven't got there yet, but I feel that you're right. If we can package a lot of these tools in a kind of a serverless, almost like environment that just runs, and even Dockerize it, right? When I was doing this, Docker didn't exist, right? So if I can Dockerize it, then it becomes super easy because you just start to consume, right, the outputs of those things, right?
True. But it's just for more tools. Well, I'm guessing that as long as you can put it into the continuous integration, whatever they're using, just call it. Yeah, why not?
Exactly, right.
And the stuff there, man.
No, dude, like I was literally on fire when I was doing this because I was building tools left, right, and center. I was automating everything I was doing. Like literally, I was basically writing, like I said, like I would do security assessments where I would spend the first 2 days of the assessment writing tools to understand the application, and then I would find insane vulnerabilities, like literally, because I would model the app, right? Like I would take an app and I would basically spend time to map the attack surface. Especially if I had the source code, I would connect the outside with the inside. I would analyze it, and then think about it, like when you do source code analysis or pen testing, you always asking questions, right? You always ask, creating hypotheses, and then you're validating those hypotheses, right? That's how you work. What about this? What about that? Try this, try that. The difference is I'll be coding my hypothesis. I'll be coding my assessment. So and the more I did it, the faster I become, because I would always building tools. So I was almost like, I'll be half sharpening the saw. I was half building a tool, which I get to reuse not just now but the next time, but I was customizing to the app that I was testing.
That's pretty smart.
And then if you do that over and over again, you end up with something like the O2 platform, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I just thought that everybody was doing the same thing, right? And then
Oh, no.
once I moved into other things, because I then, was developing, and I then actually got into a lot of, defending code. I started doing projects where I was actually running AppSec teams and all that stuff. So I had less time to code. I was less doing the hands-on.
Right.
I was always very frustrated by going, man, do you realize how fast it would be to automate that?
Sure.
All right, man. Let me stop the recording. So yeah, so let's continue this over the next series of months. And I really like your idea, Andrea, of doing a couple of use cases, right? The live in the O2 platform user.
Yeah.
Cool.